Since debuting back in 2007, the Assassin's Creed franchise has changed, well, a lot. No longer the stealth action adventure we once knew, it's now a series of deep and lengthy action RPGs. And sure enough, Assassin's Creed Valhalla looks to deliver another sprawling role-playing experience. But that begs the question, what's new here besides, of course, bloodthirsty Vikings? Actually, a lot. There's an entirely new combat system, a revamped character customization model, a whole new take on the Animus, a new base building mechanic, and heck, Valhalla is even bringing back some of the mechanics that made the series so popular to begin with. Of course, the game doesn't release until November 10th, but before then, I hope you'll join me as I look at everything we know about the world and the gameplay of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Before we begin, I want to introduce you to the new video game podcast I'm creating with fellow YouTuber JV. It's called Preloaded, and just like the content on this channel, Preloaded is dedicated to previewing all of the biggest and most exciting upcoming video games. We cover news, gameplay details, and hands-on impressions. And best of all, it's free. You can catch the video version of Preloaded right now over on JV's YouTube channel, or you can listen on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. I've left the links in the description, but for now, let's dig in to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Assassin's Creed Valhalla begins in the year 873, and you play as Eivor, the leader of a Viking clan preparing to leave the frigid Scandinavian north and settle the more fertile and temperate kingdoms of England. While the vast majority of the game will take place in England, you'll also get to explore and even revisit Norway throughout your journey. And we know that, according to lead producer Julien Laferrière, the game will also include, quote, a few surprise areas. As for square mileage, there have been conflicting statements regarding the map's actual size. Laferrière said, quote, I would actually say in terms of range, Valhalla is probably a bit larger than Assassin's Creed Odyssey. But this contradicts a prior statement from one of Ubisoft's heads of communications, Malek Tafaha, who said in a tweet that Valhalla, quote, won't be the longest or biggest game in the series. However, that tweet was deleted, and even if Valhalla is smaller than Odyssey, I'd expect at least 80 hours of gameplay, but that's if you want to explore everything. So what will you explore? Well, Norway and those few surprise areas haven't been shown, but we do know that England will be split into 4 kingdoms. Wessex in the south, Mercia to the west, Northumbria up north, and East Anglia, which we got to see in the demo and has drawn comparisons, at least aesthetically, to The Witcher 3. As I'll get to later, each of these kingdoms will play into how Valhalla's narrative unfolds as you form alliances, but they'll also come into play as you meet the game's villains. For example, one antagonist, King Alfred, rules over the kingdom of Wessex. And while I'm not sure it will play as much into the geography, we also know that both the Assassins and Templars will be a part of this world. As put by Ashraf Ismail, who formerly served as creative director on Valhalla, quote, yes, we run across Assassins and Templars, or Hidden Ones and Order of Ancients in this time period. He also went on to explain that Eivor will actually work together with the Assassins at some point. Getting back to the map, we've seen mostly countryside locations, but you'll also get to explore at least 3 main cities: London, Winchester, and Jorvik, known today as York. As you'd expect, there will also be a slew of towns and smaller settlements. And speaking of settlements, one thing that's entirely new in Assassin's Creed Valhalla is that you'll be building your very own Viking settlement from the ground up. In other words, base building is now a core gameplay mechanic. Throughout your playthrough, you'll gather resources and raw materials that you can use to expand your base. As put by Ismail, quote, a lot of what you're doing in the game world is at the end of the day gonna feed into the settlement, end quote. Now, I haven't been able to determine whether you can choose where on the map to settle or whether the game decides for you, but we do know that your camp must at least be located on a river, as your facilities will include a shipyard for customizing your longship. You'll also gain access to a range of building types, and according to Ismail, quote, each building comes with its own gameplay purpose. One that we know of is your barracks, which will allow you to, quote, get better troops, and as your settlement expands, you'll also gain access to, quote, useful services, better tools, and new settlers. These will include your blacksmith, who I presume will upgrade your weapons, as well as a tattoo parlor and a barber shop, both of which allow you to modify Eivor's appearance. But your settlement is more than just a place to receive upgrades. According to Valhalla's narrative director, Darby McDevitt, it'll also be integral to Valhalla's story progression. Quote, we want you to have quests with people in the settlement. You solve problems in the settlement. New settlers come in, new people to interact with, small little quests and moments, and lots of little surprises. End quote. Your settlement is also where you'll access your Alliance map, which it seems will help you decide where to go next, both geographically and narratively. Main quest lines have been called by the developers as, quote, territory arcs, and it sounds like these will involve forging alliances within the game's various kingdoms. We saw one of these take shape in the demo as Eivor earned the trust of a king named Oswald. Deciding which territory arcs to take on and which alliances to forge appears to happen at your Alliance map, which shows not just what rewards might await in certain territories, but also whether you're appropriately leveled to enter said region. So as a side note, yes, level gating does appear to guide your quest, at least to an extent. Once you decide where to go next, the act of exploring in Valhalla will feel a lot different, but not everything is changing. You still have a horse to ride around on, though it now has a stamina meter and it can now swim. Also, fast travel looks to work in more or less the same way. That is, you can jump to and from synchronization points. But things get a lot different once you hop into your longship. Carving a sort of medieval highway system throughout England are inland rivers and waterways that you can use to quickly sail from place to place. In that this will be your fastest method of travel outside of fast travel, you'll be sailing a lot in Valhalla. Plus, your longship comes with a crew of Viking warriors who you yourself recruit, and who are fully customizable. And traveling with a boat full of badasses enables you to quickly launch full-scale raids. I'll expand on raids later, but as put by Le Ferrier, quote, any military location you encounter on the rivers of England is fully raidable, end quote. And if you're on the way to a raid and you just want to enjoy the view, your longship has a cruise control option where you can set a waypoint and take in the scenery as you automatically sail to your destination. And if that wasn't relaxing enough, you can also command your crew to sing a Viking melody or tell a story to pass the time. But much of your time, of course, will be spent on foot, and for the most part, hoofing it in Valhalla looks to work pretty much the same as it did in Odyssey. It looks like you can still climb anything, and parkour remains a, quote, core element of the game. But one element that's become more challenging is finding, then acquiring all the loot hidden throughout the world. That's because the game features more environmental puzzles, even if they are rather simple. Here we see Eivor firing an arrow through the rear window of a dwelling to break the lock off the front door from the inside. Another instance I saw had Eivor blowing up an explosive barrel to break through a cracked wall, while another required exploring a dried-up well to locate the key to a nearby cottage. But some puzzles were more elaborate. In what must have been one of the demo's more lengthy side quests, Eivor had to track down 3 swords that fit into slots on a statue that itself was hidden underground. According to Valhalla's quest director Philippe Bergeron, the team thought much about how to work puzzles into this world. Quote, we wanted the exploration to make you feel smarter, so we played a lot with puzzle solving, so making sure that every house you find sort of appeals to you, like it draws your attention, and then when you want to come and explore, it's not given to you. You still have to work for it a little bit, end quote. One final bit on exploration that I want to touch on is that, just like in Assassin's Creed Origins and Odyssey, which both let you take control of your pet eagle, Valhalla lets you take to the skies as a raven named Sinan. As Sinan, you can scout enemy encampments and mark the location of resources, but you can now also see waypoints in the distance far more clearly as you fly around in real time. This gives you a much better idea of how far you have to travel. Also, unlike Odyssey, it doesn't sound like you'll be able to use Sinan to mark every enemy in an encampment. That said, you can place an actual waypoint on an enemy, allowing you to easily follow, say, one high-value target over long periods of time. And speaking of waypoints, you might have noticed that most of them are either blue or yellow. And that plays into the new ways Assassin's Creed Valhalla is handling not just waypoints, but also quests. Let's take a look. Quests in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, whether part of the main story or optional side missions, are working a bit differently than in prior games. As for main quests, these will span vast, epic, and branching storylines that the developers have called territory arcs, which will see Eivor forming alliances throughout the game's various regions. Again, we got to see this in the demo as players spent several hours working to build a relationship with King Oswald of East Anglia. In true RPG fashion, these quests will provide opportunities to make choices that, hopefully, have meaningful impacts on the story. In fact, McDevitt has confirmed that each of these arcs will feature, quote, at least one major choice. But I'm skeptical as to how consequential these choices might actually be. I am going to get into some very minor story spoilers here, but nothing we didn't see in the demo. Skip ahead to the timecode I've marked at the bottom of your screen if you want to stay 100% spoiler-free. Okay, what we saw in the demo was that at some point, Eivor must rescue Oswald from a rival Viking leader named Ruud. Once you defeat Ruud, you have the choice to either kill him or spare his life. Spare him and he'll return later in that same mission to kill Oswald. Now, if Oswald were to die, that would be a major consequence. But when Ruud challenges Oswald, you have another choice. You can either let Oswald fight for himself, or you can fight in his place. Choose the latter and you'll eventually kill Ruud once and for all. But from what I found, even if you let Oswald fight for himself, he still survives. Or as Bergeron put it, quote, ultimately, in all scenarios, you still have an alliance with Oswald. That means the stakes are never quite as high as the game would lead you to believe. Sure, choices will have an impact on shorter storylines, but we have yet to see whether player agency will actually change the broader narrative. Nonetheless, the game does look to provide some interesting main story quests, which will be marked on your map with a distinctive blue design. They'll also show up in your quest log, but when it comes to side quests, those won't appear anywhere in your quest log. Instead, they'll appear only as a smaller waypoint on your map, and only after you've found them by actually exploring the world. This is similar to how things worked if you played Assassin's Creed Odyssey with exploration mode turned on, but again, now side quests won't overpopulate your quest log. Hopefully this will make Valhalla feel a little less overwhelming. That said, you will still have a checklist of things to do. See that rectangle in the bottom right corner of the screen? That indicates all the side objectives you have in one particular territory, and they're split into 3 categories. Wealth opportunities, which lead you to special chests containing valuable loot. Secrets, which involve tracking down the game's numerous collectibles. I'll get into what some of those are in a bit. And finally, mysteries, which most closely resemble traditional side quests, each featuring a short storyline that you have to resolve. Now, remember when I mentioned that quests appear as either blue or yellow waypoints? This refers to wealth opportunities, which are yellow, and mysteries, which are blue. And again, they appear only after you've discovered them, presumably by talking to NPCs, triggering some event, or perhaps by activating nearby synchronization points. As for secrets, from all the footage I've seen, they don't seem to get marked on your map at all. But hey, they are secrets after all, and maybe the developers wanted them to be harder to find. Now, one important note is that the developers have often described some side quests as, quote, world events, which are spontaneous events you trigger and experience as you explore, and which do provide certain objectives. According to a video posted by EUROGAMER, mysteries, which again involve resolving short storylines, are classified as world events. One example includes a mission where you recruit a cat, yes, a cat, to join your crew. Another required finding a lost horse for its owner, and yet another had you fighting a bloodthirsty nun who, out of nowhere, tries to kill you. But world events might also refer to other, more drawn-out quest lines that will take much longer to resolve. For example, there was that puzzle I mentioned earlier that required tracking down 3 swords, then finding the statue they belong to. And then there are, quote, world bosses. In the demo, we saw one world boss named Regan who poisons you, then forces you to battle her as you hallucinate a flurry of supernatural attacks and fire effects. Furthermore, Regan is actually one in a series of bosses known as the Daughters of Lyrian, and you'll presumably have to defeat them all in order to complete their associated quest line. Another series of bosses called Drenger are warriors seeking an honorable death, and they'll each challenge you to a fight whenever you encounter them. And while we're on the topic of bosses, I do want to mention that Valhalla will also feature legendary animals that you can track down and kill, just like in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And as a side note on animals, Ubisoft did release this screenshot, which seems to confirm 2 things. 1, polar bears, and 2, there might be some ability that lets you tame animals and have them fight by your side. Getting back to activities and side quests, let's look at secrets. Now, I mentioned that these involve hunting down collectibles, and some of these are pretty cool. One in particular, called Paper Chases, should be familiar to fans of older Assassin's Creed games. They involve using your parkour skills to literally chase down sheets of paper that are magically floating along a set path. And what are on these pages? It's been confirmed that some will feature tattoo designs which you can then apply back at your settlement. We also know the game will feature a paper collectible called Schemes, which are essentially blueprints for upgrading your longship. It hasn't been confirmed, but perhaps these will also be discovered via these paper chases. Moving on, another collectible are cursed symbols, hidden ornamental relics that you have to hunt down by playing a game of hot and cold. You see, cursed symbols emit an eerie sound and distort your vision, and these effects get stronger the closer you get. Simply find them and destroy them to check them off your list. Another puzzle-oriented side activity consists of finding certain ruins or temples, then aligning the camera to just the right angle in order to reveal a symbol. Now, it hasn't been specifically detailed by Ubisoft that all of these fit into the secrets subcategory, but I do think that's a safe bet. But the game has plenty of other side activities that I'm guessing won't necessarily count towards any of your to-do lists. One that has garnered plenty of attention is flighting, which is basically a form of Viking rap battle. An opponent throws an insult your way, and your job is to select a clever response in a limited amount of time.
To all those whom I speak, they say Eivor's a clod.
Then you're speaking to fools and their knowledge is flawed.
Well.
Win the battle and you'll not only get some coin, but you'll also upgrade Eivor's charisma stat. This makes me wonder what other character-based stats you'll build up throughout the game, as this is something Ubisoft hasn't really touched on, like, at all. Anyways, there are also drinking games. In one, you basically have to out-chug a challenger while keeping your balance, and another lets you grab your bow and arrow for some drunk target practice. What could possibly go wrong? There's also a dice game that I haven't been able to find anything about, and finally, if you're looking for someone who's more than just a friend, there will be romance options as well, though from what I've seen, it's not so much romance as it is taking your partner straight to the bone zone. Oh, and if you just want some peaceful alone time after said romance, there's one more activity that lets you balance piles of stones into towers called cairns. As with many of the activities I've mentioned so far, doing so will reward you with a skill point. Needless to say, there's a lot to do in this Viking world, but as you know, Assassin's Creed doesn't take place entirely in the historical realm. It also has a present-day storyline, and Valhalla is doing some new things to make that narrative feel less like a tacked-on element, and more like an integral part of the entire experience. If there's one thing that's remained constant throughout the entire Assassin's Creed saga, it's the Animus, a device that allows people from the present day to relive past memories of historical figures. But Valhalla is treating the Animus very differently. It's been confirmed that you'll be able to access, or rather exit the Animus at any time and explore your present-day location as Layla, who we've gotten to know in Assassin's Creed Origins and Odyssey. But that's not all. We do know it will also allow you to swap between male and female Eivor at any point in the game. This is in contrast to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which required you to permanently select one gender at the outset of the game. It's also been confirmed that both the male and female versions of Eivor are canon, and McDevitt has said the ability to swap genders at any point via the Animus will serve a narrative purpose. Quote, "The gender choice in our game has a meaning. It has a meaning in the overall story. There's a very specific reason for it, and the reason is something that you will discover as you play." End quote. Adding even more intrigue is that the Animus is also going to introduce an entirely new gameplay element to Valhalla in the form of what the developers are calling Animus anomalies. We haven't actually seen these, as I believe Ubisoft has restricted any gameplay footage or screenshots from being posted, but one of these anomalies was in the demo, and here's what we know. As you explore England, Animus anomalies will reveal themselves as glitches in the historical simulation. Spot one and you'll have the option to trigger or activate the anomaly, at which point you'll actually start exploring in Old World England as Layla. That's right, you'll switch over from Eivor to Layla, and you'll then be presented with what sounds like an elaborate platforming and puzzle challenge. Here's how McDevitt described the anomalies in an interview with IGN. Quote, "The story is that there are anomalies inside the simulation, and when you find them as Eivor, Layla and her handlers will pause the simulation and set up this big thing for her to deal with. It's a big puzzle, lots of intense puzzle solving and parkour, so you can acquire a bit of interesting data and then close this rift." In a separate interview with GameSpot, McDevitt also confirmed that this data you obtain at the end will contain information about Valhalla's story. As for what these anomalies will actually look like, the YouTube channel Access the Animus said the platforming challenges will involve climbing and jumping between, quote, "blue platforms in the sky." As for the puzzle solving, Access the Animus described redirecting beams of light to illuminate and reveal some of these blue platforms. Finally, once you reach the top of the anomaly, you'll be rewarded with the data packet that McDevitt referred to. Also, it sounds like Layla's parkour moves will closely reflect or even mirror Eivor's moveset. But there's another moveset, the one that involves mayhem and murder, that's most likely reserved for Viking warriors only. And that brings me to the part of Assassin's Creed Valhalla that might just make it the most definitive Viking experience we've ever seen in a video game. Let's be honest. Combat in Assassin's Creed has never been terribly deep or complex. And while Valhalla may not demand the sharpest reflexes, it is making some changes that should add some depth. First, we know the game will have more enemy variety than any prior Assassin's Creed game, and different enemies will require different strategies. Some examples include Slayers, who are gigantic, lumbering brutes, Bannerets, who sport this banner and shield combo, and Berserkers, who are fast, nimble, and scrappy. Enemies will also get more creative. Some can hide in the bushes, then ambush you, while others can hurl objects your way, including explosives and even the bodies of fallen soldiers. As put by Ismail, some enemies can even perform synchronized, coordinated attacks as they, quote, "use the environment and each other against the player." Perhaps that's what we see here. But to even the odds, some enemies will have weak points, which radiate with a golden glow, though I think this requires unlocking the appropriate skill. Of course, this being a Viking game, Valhalla will also have the most brutal combat we've ever seen in the series. As proof, well, you know that Mortal Kombat style X-ray animation we saw in the gameplay overview trailer? Benoit Richer, one of the game's directors, confirmed in a tweet that these animations will actually appear in gameplay. But that's still just an animation. What about the actual combat mechanics? The most noteworthy new mechanic is the new dual-wielding system, which lets you hold and swing any two single-handed weapons simultaneously. That includes 2 axes, 2 swords, a sword and an axe, a sword and a shield, or even 2 shields, which actually looks far less awkward than it sounds. The overall system is actually somewhat complex, but in a good way. Here's how I understand it. Each weapon has both a light and heavy basic attack. To use these, you'll have to hold that weapon in your right or your primary hand. Each weapon will also have a more powerful special attack, but this is reserved for the weapon in your left or your offhand. So basic attacks are for your right hand and special attacks are for your left hand. In other words, each weapon will have different moves depending on which hand it's in. Then there are combos. When you string together multiple heavy attacks, multiple light attacks, or any combination thereof, that's when Eivor starts using both hands and you start swinging in a rhythm that wielding just one weapon wouldn't allow for. And of course, pairing different weapons together will yield different combos. In fact, different weapon combos look to yield entirely different combat styles. Just consider wielding 2 flails as opposed to 2 shields. Things change even more with 2-handed weapons. I believe these also have a light, heavy, and special attack, but as the name implies, they don't allow for dual wielding. However, it looks like you can cheat the system somewhat by holding a 2-handed weapon in your left hand and going barehanded in your right. I discovered this by watching a fantastic video posted by BOOMSTICK Gaming, which focuses entirely on combat and clearly shows Eivor swinging a 2-handed axe while simultaneously throwing punches. I definitely recommend watching BOOMSTICK's video if you want a deeper understanding of Valhalla's combat, so I've left a link in the description. Moving on, shields, as I've mentioned, also play a big role in Valhalla's combat, and they also have multiple movesets. Hold one in your left hand and it can be used to perform blocks. Hold one in your right and it can be used to attack. And if you hold a shield in each hand, well, you can string together custom shield combos. Enemies also have shields and theirs appear to be destructible. Heavy attacks and certain weapons, like the flail, seem to be particularly effective at breaking them apart. One weapon that likely won't fit into the dual wielding system is your Viking harpoon. I'm not sure we've seen this in any actual gameplay, but Ubisoft's official gameplay overview made it very clear that this will not only be a weapon you can use, but that it can literally decapitate your opponents. Oh, and there's one final weapon I want to cover, at least when it comes to face-to-face combat, or rather face-to-foot combat. Unlock the Stomp skill in the game's skill tree and you'll be able to use your boot for what looks like a finishing blow. But whether you fight with your foot, your harpoon, or 2 axes at once, Valhalla is adding more depth to the combat with other mechanics that don't have to do with weapons, at least not directly. First, there's the stamina meter, which you'll deplete when you dodge or execute heavy attacks. But if you connect with a light attack, you'll gain some stamina back. Also, you can parry enemy attacks, and that's actually a big part of Valhalla's new stun system. You'll notice that enemies have a second meter right above their health. I've heard this called a stun meter, and apparently you can deplete it by executing successful parries and landing heavy attacks. When this meter is depleted, it will open your enemy to a devastating stun attack. In an interview with VG247, assistant level design director on Valhalla, Laurence Lethelian, said that you can also stun foes if you, quote, shoot an arrow at a specific part of the body on an enemy. This might be referring to the weak points I mentioned earlier. And speaking of arrows, archery is of course here as well. On top of your traditional bow, Valhalla also has a rapid fire bow which allows you to shoot multiple arrows per second, and it looks awesome. It also seems that arrows can be used to take out enemies in creative ways. For example, you can shoot down whatever these are, crushing any enemies below, and you can shoot fire-tipped arrows at explosive containers or at flammable buildings if you want to burn an entire village to the ground. And lastly, it looks like a well-aimed shot can lower drawbridges. So we've looked at how you can deal damage, but what if you take damage? Well, Valhalla has a brand new health system. Whereas Odyssey's health would automatically replenish outside of combat, and a special ability also allowed for a quick health boost during combat, Valhalla will feature nothing of the sort. Instead, you'll have to replenish your health by harvesting consumables like mushrooms and berries, as well as meat from animals you hunt and fish you catch. Yes, Assassin's Creed finally joins the pantheon of RPGs that let you go fishing. Anyways, you can consume food items individually or mix them to create rations, which you can then store and, from the looks of it, use in or out of combat. I'm assuming the number within this heart icon indicates how many rations you have left, but I haven't been able to find what the circle meter that surrounds the heart is for. Perhaps it indicates how many resources you need to gather before mixing your next full ration. So that covers much, if not all, of the individual combat mechanics we know of. But just like in Odyssey, which featured conquest battles, you'll get to experience large-scale battles in Valhalla as well. These come in two types, the smaller of which are called raids. As I mentioned earlier, these can be triggered from your longboat at any time you sail up to any riverside military encampment. Simply approach the shore and when prompted, press the designated raid button. You can also trigger a raid on foot using Valhalla's new ability wheel, which provides quick access to a number of frequently used abilities like fishing, calling your horse, lighting a torch, and as we see here, blowing your war horn, which calls in your crew to help clear out the enemy. Now, you can take out an encampment's defenses all while cloaked in stealth, but stealth is a solo effort and we know that the most valuable loot found during raids will be, quote, too heavy for one set of arms. So, if you want to score the best valuables, you'll need to eventually trigger a raid. But what about even larger battles? Those are here too, and they're called assaults. These are major narrative-based events that often occur at the climax of a major questline. The one we saw in the demo involved a siege on the heavily fortified castle where Oswald was being held prisoner. As with raids, you'll go in with your Viking crew, but since assaults are tied to the story, you can't just trigger them at will. Also, assaults play out in 3 phases. The first 2 of which will require you to guide a battering ram through a wave of enemies until you reach a barricade. You can hasten this process by helping to push the battering ram, or you can leave that to your crew as you take out enemies on the battlefield. Personally, I'll take the latter option as one of the enemy tactics here is to pour scalding hot oil over the crew at your battering ram. Ouch. Plus, if any of your compatriots fall in battle, you'll be able to revive them. And this raises the question, will members of your crew be able to die permanently? We'll just have to wait and see. Anyhow, once you break through the first barricade, you'll encounter Phase 2, which features another barricade and a second wave of even tougher enemies. And finally, the third phase of the assault pits you against a boss. In this case, it's Rued and his wolf. Also, it might not be mandatory to batter down the last barricade because while players in the demo could enter this boss arena head-on, they could also sneak in using stealth, implying that assaults won't always be linear. Moving on, there is one more type of large-scale battle that AC fans have become accustomed to, but it might not be in Valhalla. I'm referring to naval battles, which we haven't seen in any gameplay footage. Furthermore, a Eurogamer article from April seemed to confirm that naval combat, if it does exist in Valhalla, won't be on as large of a scale as we've seen before. Quote, "It sounds like the naval battles of the past have been dialed back somewhat. There's no sitting and firing cannons at other boats." Now, that's a quote from Eurogamer, not Ubisoft, but Ubisoft didn't dispute the quote, and I haven't heard any developer mention any sort of large-scale naval battles. But while battling on the high seas might not be back, one thing that is making a return, and in a big way, is how you sneak around in the shadows. Before Assassin's Creed shifted towards its current RPG style of gameplay, stealth was a much bigger part of the formula. But it seems Ubisoft have decided to bring some stealth elements back in Valhalla. Now, while Vikings weren't known for their stealthy ways, sneaking around does make some narrative sense here given that Vikings weren't exactly welcome in jolly old England. The most familiar mechanic making a return is social stealth. You know the hood that for a time was all but a trademark of the Assassin's Creed franchise? Well, it's back, and with it the ability to blend in to small crowds, particularly if you find a group of monks who wear a similar hood to yours. You can activate your hood from the ability wheel, and while blending into groups will make things much easier, it's not mandatory if you want to stay undetected. For example, some towns are labeled as distrust areas. These are similar to full-on restricted areas, but not quite as hostile. Should you enter a distrust area without a hood, patrols will recognize you right away. Cloak yourself, however, and even if you're not mixing with the locals, the ability of enemies to recognize you will be more limited, even if only somewhat. Another gameplay mechanic that will no doubt assist in stealth is called Odin's Sight. Remember how I said you could use your Raven to mark enemies with actual waypoints, one at a time? Well, if you just want to visually highlight multiple enemies at once, the Pulse of Odin's Sight lets you do just that with the press of a button. To be clear, the waypoints you place with Sinan are more for following one enemy at a time, while Odin's sight visually highlights all enemies within its radius, providing more situational awareness when you're in enemy territory. Also, while not exactly stealth-related, Odin's sight will also highlight items and objects in the environment that you can interact with, as well as footprints you might need to follow. Now, this being an Assassin's Creed game, you might be happy to hear that assassinations are also getting more emphasis this time around. First off, the Hidden Blade is back, which wasn't part of your arsenal in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Second, whereas in Odyssey you couldn't assassinate enemies who were leveled higher than you, Valhalla is different. According to Ismail, you can now assassinate, quote, virtually anybody. For standard enemies, this works as usual. You sneak up and press a button to kill them from behind. But for more powerful enemies, and even some bosses, you can unlock a specific ability within the game's skill tree called Advanced Assassination. With this skill unlocked, you gain access to a minigame that will allow you to one-shot high-value targets. Basically, after you successfully sneak up on a particularly powerful enemy, a quick-time event will activate that provides a small window of opportunity. Press the attack button at the precise moment these white semicircles land inside the red shaded areas, and you'll pull off the kill. Fail, however, and you'll have to fight them face to face. As described by Assassin's Creed Valhalla game designer Jessica Marr, quote, it's not an easy minigame, but it is something that players get to choose if they feel really adventurous and want to attempt one-shotting really significant opponents, end quote. Furthermore, your margin for error gets smaller and smaller the more powerful your enemy, meaning the most powerful foes will be very difficult to assassinate. For example, I've seen several videos of people attempting to assassinate Ruid, the boss at the end of the demo's assault battle, but I haven't seen anyone with precise enough timing to execute, pardon the pun, this particular strike. Lastly, should you perform a successful assassination, you will be able to hide bodies, though that's nothing new. Okay, now that we've examined stealth and combat, let's look at how Valhalla allows you to personalize your build so you can be more effective at both. As I've mentioned before, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is, at its heart, an RPG. As such, you'll be able to personalize your character in a number of ways, such as unlocking abilities and skills, and customizing your equipment. Let's start with abilities. These refer to active combat and stealth maneuvers, and they're split into two categories: ranged and melee. Ranged abilities are geared towards archery and your raven. For example, Thorn of Slumber lets you tip your arrows with a tranquilizer and puts enemies to sleep. Ranged Poison Strike lets you tip arrows with poison, Raven Distraction lets you command your Raven to swoop in and preoccupy enemies, and Mark of Death lets you tag numerous enemies, then simultaneously fire multiple arrows, damaging all of them at once. As for your melee abilities, these include Rush and Bash, which lets you pick up an enemy and rush them against a wall, Kick of Tyr, which is basically the Viking version of your Spartan kick from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Dive of the Valkyries, which lets you leap into the air then crush your opponent's skull upon your return to Earth, and then there's Throwing Axe Fury, which is exactly what it sounds like and pretty much what you'd expect from any self-respecting Viking. Now, it appears that most, if not all, abilities will require stamina, not to mention a separate resource called adrenaline. See those gold bars right above your health? That's adrenaline, and not only is it required for performing abilities, it also depletes as you take damage. Thankfully, it replenishes as you land attacks, not unlike your stamina. Okay, now that you know how abilities work, you might be asking, how do you unlock them? Well, each ability is unlocked by finding its corresponding Book of Knowledge. These are physical books hidden throughout the world, typically within monasteries or military camps, and they're often marked as wealth opportunities. Also, there's more than one book of knowledge for each ability, and finding duplicate books will upgrade the strength and effectiveness of that ability. One last note is that just like in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you'll be able to map up to 8 abilities to your controller or hotkeys for easy access. So those are abilities, but what about skills? In Valhalla, you'll have 3 different skill trees, or rather Skyrim-esque skill constellations. And whereas abilities are active and action-based, skills are passive. That is to say, you don't activate them with the press of a button. Instead, they provide stat boosts or modify your existing set of abilities. And while abilities are unlocked by finding books of knowledge, skills are unlocked by spending skill points, which are earned throughout your character's progression and via many of the various world activities I mentioned earlier. Each of your 3 skill trees are represented by a different animal, and each is geared towards enhancing a particular play style. Wolf skills are blue and focus on enhancing dexterity and range-focused builds. Bear skills are red and geared towards builds that focus on melee and close-quartered combat, and lastly, Raven skills are yellow and focus on enhancing builds geared around stealth and assassination. Also, there are 2 types of skill nodes within each skill tree: stat nodes and main skill nodes. Main skill nodes unlock unique skills that expand your current ability set. For example, within your Raven skill set, there's the Advanced Assassination skill that unlocks the Assassination minigame I mentioned earlier. Another skill within the Raven skill tree called Brush with Death will slow time down after performing a perfectly timed dodge. On the other hand, stat nodes do what you might expect. They increase stats like damage and defense, and certain stat nodes appear in multiple skill trees. For example, consider the stat node titled Melee Training, which increases the damage for all your melee attacks. I've seen this in both the Raven and the Bear skill trees, and I imagine it also exists in the Wolf skill tree. This means should you decide to invest all your skill points into one skill tree, you won't miss out on certain essential stat boosts. That said, if you don't like how things are going, you can respec your skills. One final wrinkle to the skill system is that in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, unlocking skills is basically now how you level up. Gone is the traditional leveling system, and in its place is your power level, which from what I can tell is equal to 1 plus the number of skill points you've spent. So if you've spent 50 skill points, you'll be at power level 51. Despite confirmation that this is replacing the traditional leveling system, you do still earn experience points via gameplay, and I imagine this will count towards upgrading certain character stats like the charisma stat I mentioned earlier, though that is just a guess on my part. Getting back to your power level, as I alluded to much earlier, certain regions on your alliance map do have a recommended power level, so again, level gating is a thing in Valhalla, even though enemies don't appear to have levels. Okay, now let's finally look at gear. As it turns out, the skills you unlock are intrinsically tied to the gear you equip. That's because each piece of gear is color-coded and aligns with either the Wolf, Bear, or Raven skill set. The more skills you unlock within a certain skill tree, the greater stat boosts you'll receive by equipping gear within the same category. And that's not the only way the gear system is changing in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Unlike Assassin's Creed Origins and Odyssey, where gear was randomly generated, each piece of gear in Valhalla is custom-made. This has several consequences. One is that Valhalla has fewer pieces of individual gear, making each item that you become attached to a bit more special. Second, it will hopefully reduce the amount of time spent sorting, dismantling, and selling off dozens of obsolete items. On the other hand, gone are the incremental ability boosts we saw in the weapons from, say, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Instead, each piece of equipment in Valhalla has a set of up to 4 stats, each with their own value. For weapons, those include attack, speed, impact, and critical hit percentage. For shields, they include block, attack, and weight. And for armor, they include armor, evasion, and weight. Also, from what I can tell, gone is any sort of tiered rarity system. Instead, Valhalla features a tiered upgrade system. Based on what I've been able to learn, you can spend resources to upgrade gear through tiers like Fine and Superior, all the way up to the final tier of Mythical. Within each of those tiers are 10 smaller levels, indicated by these 10 notches. One upgrade will fill one of these notches, which will then boost the stats of that piece of gear. In the absence of a rarity system, this means, at least in theory, that you'll now be able to upgrade any item in the game so it's just as badass as any other item. According to the developers, one goal here was to make it much more reasonable to stick with one piece of gear throughout your entire playthrough, even if you discovered it near the beginning of the game. And one final note on gear is that in an interview with Game Informer, Ismail did say that, quote, at a certain point you can start customizing gear. I'm not sure what he was referring to, but it might have been the blacksmith back in your settlement, who one would imagine will be able to modify weapons and armor. Now, before I wrap things up, I do want to mention one very unique bit of gameplay that's related to customization, but in a very different way. The official Assassin's Creed Valhalla website says players will be able to, quote, create and customize your own mercenary Vikings to share online and reap the spoils when they fight alongside your friends in their own sagas. Recruit mercenaries created by other players and add their strength to your forces. Based on that quote, there will be some sort of online functionality within Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and it sounds like the biggest incentive to participate will be to earn rewards if a friend ends up adding one of your mercenaries to their Viking crew. And speaking of mercenaries, it doesn't appear that the mercenaries from Assassin's Creed Odyssey are making a return here. So if you were annoyed when they seemed to pop up at the worst possible time, well, you won't have to worry about that anymore. And with that, I've gone over everything I was able to learn about Assassin's Creed Valhalla. My general impressions are that fans of the previous two games will find plenty to love here, and fans of the older AC games might find a few particularly exciting additions. But while there is a lot of new stuff here, it seems unlikely that Valhalla will sway players who didn't like Origins or Odyssey. Again, the game releases on November 10th. As always, if you enjoyed this video, drop a like and share it with friends. And if you want more Quest Mode content, specifically preview-focused content, don't forget to check out Preloaded, the new preview-focused video game podcast that I started with friend and fellow YouTuber, JV. It's free, and you can catch the video version every Monday over on JV's YouTube channel. Or you can catch the audio version on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher. Links in the description. Finally, don't forget to check out one of my other Ultimate previews on your screen now, and if you want to keep up with what I'm playing, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at QuestModeGames. Until next time, I want to remind everyone to never stop questing.